Welcome everyone to another edition of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate's Housing, Neighborhood, and Health series. My name is Tim Kawahara, and I am the Executive Director of the Ziman Center. We are very excited to welcome back Ziman Center Senior Gilbert Fellow and dear friend of the Ziman Center, Professor Paul Ong, to present his most recent work. Before we begin, I wanted to thank our partners for today's event. Today's webinar is brought to you by the Ziman Center's Housing as Healthcare Initiative, the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, and the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. A couple of housekeeping items. Please submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, as we will have Q&A session at the end of the program. If you have substantive clarifying questions, I can certainly interrupt Professor Ong. Otherwise, we will hold all substantive questions until the end of the program. Today's seminar is titled The Spatial Dilemma of Sustainable Transportation and Just Affordable Housing. The seminar will explore California's intense affordable housing crisis and the fundamental linkage between land use, transportation, climate policy, and equity. Professor Ong will examine the reduction of vehicle miles traveled, or VMT, the spatial distribution of tenant-based housing choice voucher units, otherwise known as Section 8, and low-income housing tax credit units, or LIHTC, to understand whether geographic patterns and trends are consistent with the climate change and equity goals. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Professor Ong. Paul.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here. Good morning to everyone. Happy Lunar New Year, although very saddened by the recent tragedies. So today I want to discuss the research project we have just completed, particularly in collaboration with the Institute of Transportation Study. So we're grateful for their support. I'm also grateful to my team who did a fantastic job in terms of the analytical work and producing a report. So I want to start, next slide, please. So I want to start by framing this as talking about two, I think, very noble policies that we have in the state. One is affirmatively furthering fair housing, and that is really meant to combat the history of discrimination, particularly as it's manifested in residential segregation patterns. And the goal for this, and it's just not a California goal, it really is a HUD, a national goal for the Housing and Urban Development Department, is to foster much more inclusive neighborhoods, to give those who receive housing subsidies and support greater choices in terms of mobility, residential mobility, and by doing so to enhance equitable access to opportunities. So that's a major policy that we have nationally, we have in California, we have throughout every jurisdiction here in California. The second policy goal is really around addressing climate change and improving air quality. And part of that strategy that's directly related to land use, transportation, and the distribution of where people reside is around the idea of a sustainable community strategy. And here it is to promote the development of the types of neighborhood that would generate less greenhouse gases, and mainly through the mechanism of reducing the need to travel, particularly with private vehicles. So there's a fundamental question, given these two policies, the fundamental question is that, have we been able, in the arena of affordable housing programs, been able to achieve both of these goals? Clearly, our research is not the first. A number of people have also looked at both of these issues, and we continue to look at both of these issues. The state is supporting, for example, additional research that addresses both these policies. Next slide, please. So a little bit more detail in terms of fair housing. So to understand that, we need to understand, and most of you already know this, but it bears repeating, that we have an urban spatial structure that is highly segregated along class and race lines. And it's a system of a stratified hierarchical neighborhoods. Put simply, there are better neighborhoods and there are worse neighborhoods. And these things have broad consequences. In terms of some immediate consequences on people's quality of life, being in marginalized place, for example, means that you suffer from what we call spatial transportation mismatch. And what it does is compounds poor employment outcomes. It makes it much more difficult for those who are already suffering from discrimination, low skill, and so forth. It compounds their problem in the labor market in terms of making it much more difficult for them to search for jobs, to hold jobs, to have that spatial opportunity in terms of employment possibilities. So it has that more immediate effect in terms of the quality of life through the labor market. But there's also long-term consequences. We know that segregation, particularly racial segregation, produces inequality across generation. We've seen that, for example, in terms of the moving to opportunity experiment, where they attempted to move people in affordable housing, subsidized housing, into high opportunity areas. The impacts are not always immediate, but there's certainly in more recent research that shows that particularly when young children move to better neighborhoods, that it has a long-term outcome in terms of benefiting them socially, health-wise, economically. And this is nothing new. The fantastic work that's been done by Chetty and his colleagues has documented essentially, where one grows up sets the trajectory in terms of adulthood. That if you are raised in poor neighborhoods, your chances of escaping the bottom rung of the economic ladder is very slim. So we know that these sort of spatial structures are fundamental in the production, reproduction, and equality. So the idea is, how do you break that? And one way of breaking that is around promoting fair housing. And this has been a long-term struggle. We have struggled against unfair housing. We have struggled against redlining, struggled against restrictive covenants. And the idea of this long-term struggle really is to open up the housing market and to break down those sort of barriers that creates this urban spatial structure that is so fragmented and so stratified. Next slide, please. So the other goal is really around sustainability. There's no question that we're facing a global crisis in terms of climate change. And it's already having profound repercussions in terms of how we live, how we produce, how do we sort of move forward in terms of guarantee for the next generation a world that is better. And that's a struggle with climate change. And California, fortunately, it's been on the forefront in the United States in terms of combating the adverse effects from climate change. And it has done so in a number of different ways. But one of the key ones is dealing with our use and maybe overuse of vehicle travel. And the idea is to tackle that a number of different ways. Certainly, we're doing it through technology as we move, for example, into electrifying vehicles. So that's part of the solution. But the other part of the solution is, how do we think about the urban spatial structure and rebuild it in such a way that there is far less dependency on travel, and therefore that drives down the vehicle miles traveled, and therefore it drives down the greenhouse gases that are being produced. And the strategy behind this is around this concept of sustainable strategies. And that is, we want to have neighborhoods that essentially have the characteristics that means that we're less reliant on vehicle travel. We make these neighborhoods more walkable. We give them access to things that they need, such as shopping, socializing, and so forth. And we also give them better access to public transit. And therefore, all of these things contributes to tackling the problem of climate change. It's certainly not the only solution, but it is one of the key components about how do we address this. And also, fortunately, California, in its effort to address climate change, has also been committed to environmental justice. That is, as we move forward with climate change initiatives, we want to make sure that it's done in an equitable fashion, in a fair fashion. Next slide, please. I want to look at these two policies in terms of, are we achieving both policies simultaneously? I want to look at it through the lens of affordable housing. So affordable housing is one approach in terms of how do we assist marginalized populations. How do we help them deal with the affordability crisis that we're facing? And the example I want to talk about today is around the geographic location of affordable housing through the Section 8 voucher program. And particularly how the patterns that we're seeing, the locational patterns, the spatial patterns that we're seeing, what do they tell us in terms of achieving the two major public policies I talked about? We've also done similar research on low-income housing tax credit, but today I want to focus on the Section 8 voucher program. And the central question is whether changes in the observed geographic patterns are moving us in the direction that we want in terms of affordable housing, in terms of meeting both sustainability and social justice, in terms of fair housing, in terms of ability to live in those types of neighborhoods that we find desirable in terms of addressing climate change. Next slide, please. So to answer this question, we developed the following research project. Again, the key question, the research question is, how has the location of vouchers housing programs changed in respect to transportation sustainability and fair, just housing? And to do this, we're taking data from two time periods, 2012 and 2019. And this is data at the tract level. Tract is probably pretty close to the way we think about neighborhoods. Certainly they're not perfect, but operationally, empirically, they are very useful geographies that we could use to look at how the urban spatial structure is formulated and how people move within that urban spatial structure. We use a number of different data sources, clearly the information from HUD in terms of Section 8 housing. We also use the American Community Survey to understand the characteristics of neighborhood, socioeconomically and otherwise. CalVirus Screen, which is a fantastic tool developed here in California for us to assess what's happening in terms of the environment that people live in. And then also we are using the CNK Center for Neighborhood Knowledge Transportation Disparity data set. That was a data set that we created in collaboration with California Air Resource Board and Caltrans. It is meant to be a tool in terms of helping stakeholders understand the particular characteristics of the neighborhood with respect to transportation, with respect to where clean vehicles are, access to public transit, access to active transportation, such as walking and biking and so forth. So these are the sources of information to help us do the analysis. And the way we look at it is looking at some key neighborhood indicators, including vehicle miles traveled, access to high quality, or being in a high quality transit location. And we define that as it's a location where you have frequent buses coming, and it's within walking distance in terms of reaching a bus stop. We also look at walkability, issues about traffic safety, air pollution. In the socioeconomic side, looking at things such as poverty rates, unemployment rates, job access, job housing fit. Job access is our traditional transportation approach to saying if you reside in a certain area, what is the job opportunities nearby and farther away, and giving more weights to jobs that are nearby. Job housing fits in some ways is an improvement on that. It looks at not just job access, but job access relative to certain skill levels. So these are all the neighborhood indicators we look at in terms of trying to answer the research question. Next slide, please. So just to give you an overview of what's been happening with Section 8 housing, one of the good things about Section 8 housing during the period we're looking at, and this is for California, is that between 2012 and 2019, that the number of housing units that's supported actually expanded. This graph is just a sort of overview of what's happened in Section 8 during the two time periods. There's a huge number of those units in terms of where people reside, not individual units, but units within neighborhoods that have not changed. But what we also observe is that a number of neighborhoods are losing Section 8 housing, and even a larger number of neighborhoods are gaining Section 8 housing. So the question is, how has this shift played itself out in more geographic detail? Next slide, please. I want to just give you a spatial sense of the distribution of Section 8 housing, as well as one of our indicators. For this today, I just wanted to show the poverty one. We could certainly look at other indicators, but this is just meant as illustrative. So you see on the left for 2012, that's our baseline. So on the left, the darker the shade, the higher share of Section 8 housing within that tract. And what you see, so this is a map of Southern California. I apologize to our other California colleagues that we are so focused on Southern California. But anyway, on the left is essentially a map of Southern California from the San Fernando Valley down to the northern half of Orange County. And what you see is that Section 8 housing certainly is not randomly distributed throughout the region, but instead are concentrated. They're concentrated in essentially key urban core areas. And both in Los Angeles as well as in Orange County. So those are the core urban areas. Even in suburban areas, such as the San Fernando Valley, it's not even distributed. It's on the east side of the San Fernando Valley, and that's up and towards the western part of the map. Those are traditionally the more Latino areas, low-income areas. On the right is a map of poverty rates here by tract. And one of the most important things is that visually we can see that there's a great deal of overlap, that Section 8 housing is going into those neighborhoods that are poor. And it's not surprising the way Section 8 housing operates is that it is a program where landlords could or could not participate in. So in those sort of neighborhoods, poor neighborhoods, we find areas that also have a higher concentration of Section 8 housing. The question is not so much the cross-sectional relationship. What we're concerned about in terms of whether we're achieving both of the policies is how things have changed over several years. Next slide, please. So this shows us some of the overview of changes. On the left is the changes in terms of Section 8 housing by census tracts. So areas that are blue and green are areas that over this time period gain Section 8 housing. The areas that are orange, red, and are areas that we saw a significant loss of Section 8 housing. And again, if you look at this visually, what it starts telling you is that where it's gaining are essentially in much poorer neighborhoods. So this is what we see visually. So let's now turn to much more sort of numerical analysis of this changing pattern. Next slide, please. So let's start with transportation sustainability. So as we mentioned, it's desirable to develop neighborhoods that generate lower VMT per household. And so on the graph on the left are a set of bars. So the blue bars are essentially the distribution of Section 8 housing across the 5 quintiles in terms of VMT generation. So on the left are neighborhoods that generate the least amount of VMT per household. And on the very right are the neighborhoods that generate the most number of VMT. The blue line is our base year. It shows, the distribution, and what we see is in the base year, Section 8s are more concentrated in neighborhoods that on the average generates less VMT per household. The gold bar is essentially the change, the net change in Section 8 housing. So these are the marginal gains and losses. And what we see on the left one is that if you just think about VMT average generation per household, that we are moving towards having Section 8 people live in neighborhoods that on the average generate less VMT. It's amazing how much you could see at the lowest quintile in terms of the net changes, that it accounts for over half of the net changes in terms of Section 8 housing. At the ones that generate the most amount of VMT on the right, there's actually a net loss. We could also look at that. So on the left is total household VMT. On the right is commuter VMTs. These are VMTs that are generated by people commuting to work. And here we still see a very similar pattern, although it's not necessarily identical to household VMT. We do see that by and large at the base year, that Section 8s are concentrated in the neighborhoods generating lower commute VMT. And what we also see is that in terms of the net changes, that the greatest change occurs in the neighborhood, the lowest VMT, although the pattern of change is not just linearly downward. There's an upturn at the right-hand end. So one could argue that essentially Section 8 is moving people into neighborhoods that generate less VMT, either at the household level or in terms of job commute. It doesn't say that each Section 8 households and workers generate these types of VMT, but it says that they're moving in neighborhoods that for a number of reasons may depend less on vehicle travel. Next slide, please. And we also can look at access to public transportation. And our measure is whether or not, what we classify neighborhoods in terms of its ability to access high quality transit. And if a neighborhood has many transit locations that's well served and so forth, and that the bus stops or the transit stops are within reasonable walk distance, we consider it a high quality transit location. And so this pattern is amazingly very similar to what we saw in terms of we measure walkability or we measure high quality index, that Section 8 people are concentrated in the areas that have high quality transit, and that's particularly true for the marginal change. Actually, I think the slides are wrong. But anyway, that is the pattern, going back to our report, that we see that Section 8 housing is located in walkable neighborhoods, and increasingly so, and that they're located disproportionately high quality transit location, and that has become truer over time. Next slide, please. But there's a downside. One of the issues with just looking at VMT is that there are other consequences in terms of traffic and pollution. And yeah, the neighborhoods that have low VMT quite often are located in areas that generate lots of traffic coming in. And the high volume of traffic is associated with higher probability of vehicle accidents, as well as in terms of polluting more, generating more mobile sources of air pollution. So on the left is the vehicle accident rate by neighborhoods from the lowest to the highest. For Section 8, the base years already shows that that the concentration increases with accident rates. And so that means that Section 8 people are living in areas that are much more dangerous because of traffic accidents. And that's become truer over time in terms of our study period. And we could see the same issue in terms of pollution from mobile sources, and that's on the right. And clearly, people in Section 8 tends to live in areas with higher pollution. This is not something remarkably new. There's been lots of research done on it, including research done with my colleagues throughout the years. But what's also happening is that Section 8 households are increasingly being concentrated in high pollution neighborhoods. Next slide, please. And then also in terms of the fair housing, one of the things we would prefer to see if we could achieve fair housing is a deconcentration of Section 8 households from very poor areas by poverty rate, for example, and also a integration into neighborhoods that have fewer people of color. On the left is the result in terms of the concentration of Section 8 recipients in terms of poverty rates for the neighborhood. On the left is the neighborhoods, cluster of neighborhoods with the lowest poverty rate. On the right are the neighborhoods with the highest poverty rate. And we see from the baseline that Section 8 people are already over-concentrated in poor neighborhoods, and the marginal change is remarkably and disappointingly in terms of having the net changes really occurring among the poorest neighborhoods. In terms of racial segregation, we look on the right and we look at and we array the neighborhoods by the relative number of non-Hispanic whites. And what we see here is that there is segregation And the segregation continues in terms of marginal change, not as dramatic as in terms of the class concentration in poor areas, but certainly we still see a continuation of racial segregation. Next slide, please. We could also look in terms of employment opportunities. And we could look at it in terms of just, for example, on the right are traditional metrics of job access. And that would indicate maybe we're doing a little bit better. But the problem with that is that these are jobs, all jobs, spatial access to all jobs, regardless of skills. If we break that down farther by using our metrics of job housing fit, and remember the job housing fit allows us to look at, particularly for less skilled, low wage workers, the degree of spatial match or mismatch. And so what we see is that after you adjust for skill levels, that Section 8 recipients tend to be concentrated baseline in the areas with less job opportunities. That's on the left side, the lowest. And over time, it has become worse. So that's sort of the overview of the metrics, the findings by looking at the metrics. And so what are the causes for this? And it's not simple, but clearly one of the causes is what's been happening in the housing market, the affordability crisis. Next slide, please. So one of the things is just looking at to what degree Section 8 housing vouchers, the amount of subsidy, the amount that's paid to landlords, have kept up with the housing market. And one of the things is trying to estimate what are the current market rates. And you can't use, for example, the overall rent level in a neighborhood, because the rent level, the average for all renters, is a combination of people who are recent movers as well as people who've been there for a long time. We know from the research on the rental market, there's a 10-year discount. That is, the longer you're there, the less you pay compared to the prevailing market rate. And so that's the blue line is the average for all. But what you notice is that in this analysis about what's been happening with rent during this time period, that the ones who moved in more recently, those who reflect the prevailing market rate that exists, is much higher. So one of the things that we know is that rent's been increasing as part of the affordability crisis. And on the right is a comparison of how much the rents that's being paid to landlords through Section 8 has kept up or not kept up with changes in the rental market in terms of new rents. And we do see some areas that the local jurisdictions running Section 8 housing, are actually keeping up or actually doing better than what's happening in the market. But for the vast majority of Section 8, they're in jurisdictions that are just barely keeping up or falling behind in terms of the market rate. So clearly, maybe I'm biased because my training as an economist, but clearly the market forces is one of the factors that explains the pattern that we've seen earlier in terms of the various metrics. Next slide, please. So one of the things is, how do we think about tackling this problem? And I want to be a bit upfront that I have no easy solution. And I do appreciate the people on the front line who have to struggle with this. And so clearly they have a better sense about what's feasible, what can be done. But from my perspective, let's start off by just acknowledging that currently there's a structural trade-off between fair housing and sustainability. The way I like to tell my students about how to think about this is the current crisis faced by the Federal Reserve. That is, it's difficult to fight inflation without the risk of going into a recession. And so this is uncomfortable trade-off that we wish didn't exist, but it's a reality in the world. So we have currently, in terms of the way the two policies operate in the real world, a trade-off. It's hard to promote sustainability and fair housing at the same time. The more we push on one, the less we get on the other. So that's the current structural trade-off we face. And clearly there are some short-term actions that could mediate what we could do. This includes, for example, a much more aggressive efforts to reach landlords to participate in Section 8. There's also been experimenting about varying the rent subsidy across different neighborhoods. And so you can expand the geographic locations of where Section 8 households can have a choice. Now, clearly that also creates its own trade-off. That is, the higher the rent subsidy, the fewer you can subsidize. And so there are probably some short-term things that we could do better. Part of it is doing better, and this is sort of my research point of view, is that we need better metrics and better monitoring what's happening. Up until recently, we don't have systematically a way of thinking about the two policies, sustainability and fair housing, and how do we create real-time metrics and so we can monitor it, so we can better understand what's happening and better understand, where we're going, and hopefully that gives us insight in terms of how pressing these problems are. The last one is sort of, pie in the sky, long-term solution. Clearly, like many of my colleagues have spoken many times, it's hard to solve this problem without addressing the structural problem in terms of artificial undersupply of affordable housing. Whether we're talking about zoning, restrictions on building, a number of other factors that over the decades led us to this affordable housing crisis because of undersupply of housing. So those are my trade-off thoughts. Next slide, please. So the conclusion. Unfortunately, Section 8 housing has been shifting in a pattern that is making it very difficult for recipients to be in safe neighborhoods, to be in neighborhoods that have produces better outcomes in terms of health, social outcomes, employment outcomes. I should also say that it's also making it difficult to access quality education, K through 12 education. The same patterns we also see, although we didn't report it, I didn't report it here today, in low-income housing tax credit, the changes in location between 2012 and 2019. And so I think this is really creating a challenge to state and local governments about how you simultaneously address climate change as well as promote more racial and economic equity, and the need for both thinking short-term and long-term solution. Next slide, please. And so I want to close by thanking our funders, as well as thanking my colleagues who put together the analysis as well as report. Below are links that you could go to if you're interested in seeing the full report. There are two parts to it. One around Section 8 housing, that's part one. The second one looks at our analysis of low-income housing tax credits. That's my presentation. I want to thank you for bearing with me and welcome questions.
Well, thank you, Paul. That was really terrific. And as we mentioned earlier, really important issues with regard to affordable housing, climate change, social, environmental equity, and all these other topics. So got a bunch of clarifying questions that are in nature that I just thought I'd run through really quickly. And several of them are the same, and it's, will this recording be available? It will be made available to everybody that registered, so you will receive that. There was some question about access to your actual research, Paul. I don't know if you're going to post that on CNK or where that might be found.
Yeah, that slide, the second to last slide, there are links there that they could click on to download the report.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so those are some of the earlier questions. There was a clarifying question about why did you choose 2012 as your starting date for the research? Any particular reason? Well,
it's working backwards. So 2019 was the most when we started this research project. That was the most recent. It's also kind of fortunate it's pre-pandemic that would have confounded the research, I think. So, but that was the most recent. So ours was going backwards as far as we can with consistent data that's reported. For example, the census tract used to report this changed. So between, if you go back earlier than 2012, they used the earlier tract system. So that made it more difficult to do the comparison by neighborhood. So it's more one of convenience in terms of the data. We would have preferred, actually, our original project was to look at 3 time periods, even an earlier time period, even going farther back. But that requires lots of work in terms of cleaning the data. And it would have been easier if we had actually access to the individual records, which in previous research we did have. But during this time period, HUD was not as accommodating under a previous administration.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Another sort of comment, and this came from somebody who I know, Tara Baraskis, who's the executive director of California Community Corp, so a nonprofit housing developer, who has the unenviable task of trying to build light-tech affordable housing on the west side. But she states that this research is very important in terms of the argument for producing affordable housing in high-resourced areas. Like I just say anecdotally, if you've been in LA for the last 30 years and you've taken the 10 freeway, Santa Monica freeway, east and west between downtown, you'll notice that the commute is actually reversed in that amount of time. It used to be everybody going to downtown in the morning, and then now it's the other direction. So obviously we've seen, number one, job production on the west side. So there's this issue of co-locating jobs and housing. But we've also seen, incredible unaffordability on the west side. It's very expensive. And then, another issue is that a lot of the landlords and such, there's another issue that you can hopefully comment on, don't take Section 8 housing vouchers. I mean, that's a big, huge problem, and it's probably particularly acute on the west side. But sort of how do we fix this jobs, work imbalance, home imbalance, and how do we sort of make some headways in some of these higher resourced areas that are obviously cleaner? And any comments there?
A couple of things. One is that the solution depends on people, exactly like the person who's asking this, that we need people on the ground to push for these programs, to implement them and so forth. We don't have enough of that. So part of the solution is that, I get the luxury of sitting here and talking about it and thinking about it, but the changes come through the advocates, the nonprofits, the people who are struggling to do that. Now, that being said, is that there are solutions to how do we, at least on a margin, increase the geographic access for low-income households through Section 8 and through low-income housing tax credit, that we could give them greater access here in Los Angeles, for example, on the west side. So particularly if you look at our report on low-income housing tax credit, Santa Monica stands out on the west side. And partly it is because I think it has a tradition of being progressive it has a tradition of being committed to affordable housing. It's not perfect. I mean, there are certain things that I think they could tweak to reach to serve the region, not just people in Santa Monica. But part of what that tells me, part of it is that how do we get the local jurisdictions to buy in? Because many of these housing programs, including Section 8, operated sometimes by local jurisdiction cities and so forth. How do we get them to buy in, to do it, to participate in it, to essentially assume what we call their fair share of providing housing and affordable housing? It's not a perfect solution, but certainly one that could make things much better. And this is true not just here in Los Angeles in terms of the West Side. When we look at some of the smaller, medium-sized cities, in terms of how wedded or how much they're engaged in providing and supporting and operating housing programs, there's a great deal of variation. So we have much more we could accomplish. But that really requires political will. It requires people going out there to the local jurisdiction. So that's at least on a shorter run how we do it. But again, echoing my colleagues at the Ziman Center as well as urban planning in Luskin, it's a long-term structural problem that we're facing. And unless we address that, we would not be able to essentially attenuate what I call the trade-off. We face a trade-off. We will probably always face a trade-off. Our goal, at least, is to minimize that trade-off, to make it easier so we don't face that severity of the trade-off. And that really requires tackling the larger housing problem on the long run. Exactly the types of programs that many of your other speakers in this series have advocated, zoning, inclusive housing, and so forth.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's obviously some arguments for taking housing vouchers too. A lot of them come with, social services attached to the particular tenant. And San Diego has been very successful in sort of pushing some of this through too. And let's face it, the government pays their rent on time. So, it's sort of a good way to mitigate some of the downside risk of renting in your building. But nonetheless, we see a lot of reluctance from landlords to accept the Section 8 vouchers across the city and not just in the West Side.
Yeah, I also want to add, if that's okay, Tim, it's certainly the landlords, but it's more than the landlord. I don't know if you recall the controversy of trying to increase Section 8 housing up in Lancaster and Palmdale. Mm-hmm. And the resistance up there to receiving Section 8, particularly people of color. And so it actually had to take a lawsuit to force a change in policy. So at the minimum, there was less racial discrimination in terms of that. I think the solution is both local governments supporting, but the problem is also local governments and local communities opposing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, there was actually another question too about racial discrimination in renting. And some of that is prohibited by law through the Fair Housing Act, but certainly not taking housing vouchers is sort of a de facto way to implement some of that stuff too. Another question, we're right in the middle, as you probably know, of the housing element for the state of California, and every jurisdiction needs to come up with their RHNA requirements. The city of LA, for example, I think there are 457,000 units that they're supposed to deliver in the next 8 years. From your standpoint, from an urban planner and a policy maker, I would hope that some of these issues of both climate and social equity are being considered when they're thinking about siting and coming up with the numbers of housing and where they're going to go. Do you know if that's in fact incorporated in their strategy, and what would you suggest they do from a policy perspective in terms of these new almost 500,000 homes that are supposed to come into the city of LA in the next 8 years?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. I just want to start off with that. I comment that I am very happy to see RHNA have some teeth in it right now. We worked a decade or two ago with Housing Community Development on Reno, and to try to get local jurisdiction to take on their fair share was next to impossible. I remember going around to the different major jurisdictions to talk to them about their fair share. And essentially they said, too bad, there's nothing you can do about it. But I have been impressed by the current sanctions against cities that don't have a housing element that really address, fair share housing. So I think we've made remarkable progress there. In terms of the agencies working together around these different policies and how to coordinate them, again, we've seen progress. So one of the things about climate change initiative here in California was both legislative and policy that require different agencies, housing, transportation, employment, to come together to think about, how do we address these issues simultaneously. So I think there's been a great deal of progress there. I should also say that we have much more to do. I have sat on, I can't count the number of technical advisory committees or doing projects for the various agencies where we have committees from all these agencies come together. And it's not clear to me we're not yet at the point where we are really effectively coordinating it. Part of it is, getting these silos to build bridges. But the other one is that we just don't have the tools. So I am pretty confident when I'm saying we don't have the tool. So housing could really understand sustainability. So transportation could understand access to opportunity and so forth. The only reason I know is that we have worked over the last decade or so with most of these agencies to try to come up with better metrics to monitor. One of the great lessons I learned in my education is it's fantastic to have good policies, sustainability and fair housing, but you can have the best policy possible. If it fails to implement, then you're going to fail. And so that's an important lesson. And we will fail also if we don't, for example, actively monitor what progress we're making, what progress we're not making. I think armchair scholars like myself are one of our main contribution is helping create the analytical tools and the monitoring tools that are necessary and do the research evaluation to shed light on what progress we've made, how we were able to make them, but as well as saying where we are falling short and how we could do better. And again, I think there's a contribution we could make through this type of scholarship.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think about the disparate impact rulings that have come down through the Supreme Court. And you just can't put all this stuff in the same place, right? I mean, that's discriminatory in nature. A question here from Max Gardner. Do you distinguish between new construction and existing housing in the study? Can you say whether most of the change you observed was due to landlord participation in Section 8 or changes to housing supply?
Good question. Honest answer, I don't know. Future research. Well, I suspect there are few new housing units for Section 8. We do see them in some new housing programs. For example, I've seen in some sort of project descriptions and so forth, particularly one of the other areas we work on is gentrification and infrastructure development, particularly around transit. So that over the last decade or so, that there's been a big push to allow greater housing and commercial development around major transit locations and stops. And so here in Los Angeles, Metro, for example, has made a commitment through its land that developers have to include affordable housing. And that could also include accepting Section 8. So clearly there are new units, particularly if there are incentives or requirements, that I don't want to use the word force them, but give them incentive to be more inclusive. So it's not just existing housing, there's sort of new housing. Unfortunately, we don't actually have great data to tell us precisely how effective that is. I do know that there's all of these sort of reports. I know HCD is trying to come up with a monitoring system on that. Hopefully we'll make more progress. So I think the question's great. Particularly how in new housing, we can make sure it's inclusive of different types of income used to pay for housing, including subsidy. But there's need to have that research to see if we actually are making that progress or not.
Yeah, thank you. So that'll be your next research project, Paul.
If we get funded.
If we get I do know that some of the TUC programs in the city of LA are requiring low to very low income in an inclusionary nature. I think, upwards of 15 to 20%. So hopefully that will help as well. A question from Laura: would other important metrics include noise and crime?
Yes, exactly. I think if we think about quality of life, certainly noise and crime are two important aspects of it. And so conceptually, I fully agree that these things ought to be included. The biggest difficulty is generating for the state as a whole consistent data, for example, on crime rates. And so I don't know of any systematic data set that gets down to the census tract or neighborhood level in terms of crime rates and so forth. And so it's very difficult to integrate that element into it. Noise is another one of those that affects the quality of life. And it's more than just the quality of life. It could have long-term impact on health. Certainly could have impact on education of young children in terms and so forth. So are these rippling effects that is just besides being a nuisance and disturbing you, that could impact the quality of life beyond just loud noise. So those are great things. Yes, we would very much like to have more systematic data that allow us to integrate that as part of the quality of life in terms of location of activities and so forth. It's a challenge. We know another one is a challenge, for example, about what we mean active transportation and how do we measure that? When we did the work with CARB and Caltrans on transportation disparity, there was no single source, for example, on infrastructure for bikeways. And it had to be assembled through piecemeal. So these things are incredibly important, and I'm glad there was a question about it, that we think about including these things, but it's going to take time and effort and resources to get there.
Great. Well, I want to be cognizant of time. We are at 12:30 now. There are several more questions. I don't know, Christina, can we stay on for 5 more minutes and let people drop if they have to, or?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So thanks to everybody for tuning in. If you got to go, we completely understand, but we'll just go through a few more questions here in the next 5 or so minutes and then sign off. But one question from Alicia is, what about adding the requirement for Section 80 units as a portion of the affordable units required for, say, an LA City TUC density bonus? What if we write in the requirement to spread Section 8? So requiring it. Further, part of the problem is the difficulty in and of itself adding Section 8 new construction units, of course.
I think my understanding is that these things are best negotiated when you provide development rights beyond what they already have. It's hard. I don't even think it's legally possible. I should ask my law colleagues. If they already have the rights, then it's hard to negotiate these things. if you are trading off, allowing them to have a variance, allowing them to do more development than they would have a right to, then you're certainly in position to negotiate these sort of requirements. In terms of having more legal requirements, in terms of accepting Section 8 subsidies, I think there's movement along that way because there's a whole effort of prohibiting discrimination based on source of income. And so if you have the same dollars, you shouldn't be discriminated because the dollars are coming from different sources. So there's a bit of headway there. Again, law is not my area, but I do understand from my colleagues that there are some potential, but they really require negotiating, providing additional incentives or motivation for adding it. I would like to see lot stronger requirements, but again, that's something that is a legal issue that I'm not an expert in.
Great. A question from Dan. Do you examine spatial overlap between areas that advance both equity and climate goals, and whether housing programs are helping low-income families access these places?
So essentially, you could think about, yes, we thought about that. Matter of fact, I thought about throwing up a chart of that when you have on one axis opportunity for housing, on the other one sustainability. And it's not just that, all sustainable areas are bad socioeconomically and vice versa. There are areas that you can attain both. And so the issue is, how do you get to those neighborhoods? When you have both those, just think about real estate markets. What makes a difference? Yeah, clearly location, but what about the location? It's the amenities, right? It's the amenities in the neighborhood, amenities nearby. And the problem is that when we have what we consider the goals for fair housing, access to opportunity and so forth, and we have neighborhoods that are sustainable, they have a rich mix of activities, mixed uses. You could walk to the grocery store and so forth, has access to good schools and so forth. Those are the same amenities that push up prices of housing, of rents. So it's very difficult to achieve so long as we have this uncomfortable trade-off. So yes, they exist. How do we sort of get affordable housing in them will be a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. Question from Asher. What type of impact would you guess that the influx of emergency housing vouchers in 2021-22 in LA County had on any of these issues? For those of you who don't know, the government issued emergency housing vouchers during COVID for chronically homeless people. I think probably the same issue exists, and is, can you find people that will accept them? I mean, some of the nonprofit housers will, but unfortunately, LIHTC, as great as it is, it's a very limited number of LIHTC that's available. So we really need low-income housing across the board, and not just subsidized by LIHTC, but emergency housing vouchers, Paul.
I think you answered the question. I fully agree with you. One of the things is looking at some of the emergency housing provisions that were enacted during the pandemic, and what can we learn from them? So first of all, we know a number of them are transitional. They only last as long. We're still, for example, looking at eviction protection that were extended during the pandemic and what they mean. Can we learn from them? Can we extend them? So I think many of these programs will transition out, unfortunately. Can we learn something about how they were done? I suspect yes. For example, some early analysis of some information on the protection provided against eviction during the pandemic. Was it effective? The answer is yes and no. There are households that were still being forced out, but it does seem to have an impact in terms of protecting people. Why was it more effective in some places than others? It seemed a lot has to do with people's knowledge or lack of knowledge. But the traditional barriers we have, so we have programs, protection programs, support programs, but they do no good if people don't know about them. They don't apply for them. So here in Los Angeles and in California, there are social barriers, cultural barriers, language barriers, whether you're legal or not in this country. These are barriers that, we still face, even if we have good programs.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we're going to probably have to end it here. I'll just, I'll end it with almost sort of a comment from Alexia, and it's almost more of a statement about what's been bugging her. But as a citizen and urban planner, how do you find the motivation to reduce VMT when celebrities and politicians prefer to take private jets and airships, which produce more emissions than all of us combined? Really struggle with this. So you don't need to answer that. I will just say that we need to somehow figure out the Kardashians to give up their private jets, or they are working on electric, not just electric vehicles, but electric aircraft. So maybe in the future we'll mandate that all celebrities and politicians need to take electrified airplanes in the future. So with that, I want to thank Professor Paul Ong again. This was a wonderful presentation and discussion. We'll look forward to seeing you at the next seminar. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your week and the rest of your day. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.